The man stepped on the platform of the train station, entirely lowered his heavy suitcase on the pavement. Taking the ticket out of his inside jacket pocket and glancing at his watch, he sighed with relief and began to look around, looking for a free bench. 5 meters to his right, he saw a carved bench. It was practically vacant, since an old bearded man was sitting on the edge of it. He was staring thoughtfully into the distance, leaning his palms on the butt of his cane. The man took the suitcase, took a few steps, and sat down on the bench. I made it, thank God, the man said to himself rather than to anyone else. And what was the hurry for? The old bearded man turned his whole body toward the man and bore him a sharp look. What for? The man was astonished. Because the ticket was paid. I would have been ashamed if I hadn't made it. Oh, yeah, the old man realized. Your ticket has already paid. I somehow didn't think at once. How far are you going? Far away, I'm going to work. The old man lowered his head and thought about something, but then he turned the man again. Why didn't anyone come to see you off? They already did. Yesterday, the man chuckled, making the characteristic gesture of scratching his throat. Are you going far away? I'm not going anywhere, the old man answered thoughtfully. I'm meeting. Friend or relative? No, neither a friend nor a relative, just a passenger. The old man evaded an answer. I like coming to railway station. There is a special atmosphere here, so I came before the appointment time. Do you mean it? The man asked the old man with a surprise. I, for instance, get terribly tired of markets, train station, and other crowded places. Always in such places I feel exhausted, as if someone drained my energy. Well, we're all different, the old man grunted. There is something special and fascinating in the bustle of station. I like to watch the crowd. As a rule, the mourners hug the one who leaves, smiling, and put into his bag on the platforms pies they bought. After that, the person, once in vacant corridor, hardly approaches the window to make a few farewell handshakes. It is known who originated this tradition, but almost everyone who departs always observes it. He first waves his palm at the mourners, then signs to them, asking them to leave. But the mourners are not in a hurry. To leave, they stand and stare at him intently. He is no stranger to them. Even after the train leaves, they follow him for a minute, waving. And then the platform ends. What an interesting story you tell, the man said with interest. The old man thought for a while and then continued. A man begins to settle in his place. It is not yet clear what kind of fellow travelers fate hath thrown into the carriage. He will be lucky if among the passengers there are 1 or 2 people who will cause sympathy and who will also like him. With them, he will communicate on the road, discussing news and sharing supplies. When communication becomes boring, he will prefer to lie or sit on his shelf, watching life passing by outside the window. When this actively bores him, he will go back to their place to socialize and play a few games to preference. But unfortunately, such fellow travelers very rarely manage to reach the end of the point of route. "Your reasoning is fascinating," the man remarked again. The old man continued without taking his eye away from the rails going over the horizon. "Yes, I forgot to say that a man in the carriage is bound to meet fellow travelers who will cause him to irritation, and such neighbors as a rule do the majority. However, a person will not be sympathetic to such passengers either, but both he and they will have to tolerate the presence of each other. After all, this is life. And there is nowhere to go. Faces, communication, cars, snacks, brakes, the window, and the shelf." "You're so right," exerted the man, and the old man, paying no attention to his listener, went on with his story. "From time to time, fate will give a man's gifts. Stops. They will be short, but how many emotions a person will experience when he gets out the car, breathes fresh air, stretches his tired muscles. He will be watching strangers, and in those moments it will seem to him that this is a real life. The world will no longer be blurry, like a wagon window, but wide and contrasting. But then he hears the train's horn announcing its departure. He will instantly jump into the carriage and once again be forced to endure the presence of annoying passengers. Then he climbs on a shelf and begins to leisurely look over the platform. There behind the window, people live life to the fullest. They have no restriction in the form of carriage walls, so they can afford to do whatever they want. He would even be a little jealous of them, hoping that soon he too would be able to live the same way. Sometimes men will be tempted to jump out of the wagon immediately and stay there where life is hustling, full of color and meaning. But he won't jump out. After all, he can't. After all, the ticket has long been paid for. He'll stay in the car and keep on traveling, peering through the muddy glass of the window at the passing landscapes. And then there will be moments when the pleasant companions start to leave. One by one, they will be deliberately cheerful, but with undisguised sadness in his eyes, will be alone. He will try to make friends with the other passengers, but he will realize that they are completely different from those who left. Not as they communicate, not as they think, even play much worse games of preference. The man will begin again to stare into the murky space outside the window, his fist under the chin. "Yes, that's the way it usually goes." The man nodded in agreement, but the old man wouldn't stop talking. And at such moments, a man will actively feel the lack of communication, the absence of close people, those who understand him better than others. He will clearly feel that he is tired of this life. Constantly, he has to rush somewhere, leaving behind roads, forests, forks, fields, and rivers. For the 100th time, he will mentally return for those places to which he went during the short train stops, to the places where cities rustled, merry music played, and people smiling. Their eyes shone with happiness. But unfortunately, it was too late. After all, there is no much left to go to wherever he's going. Then the train will begin to slow down until it stops completely. And the man will know that now it's definitely over. Finally, he has arrived. He'll gather his belongings, but he won't be able to shake off the intrusive thought that a part of himself, something dear and dear to his heart, has remained the train. He will try to see if all the things are packed, if nothing has fallen behind the shelf or under the table. Then he will step onto the worn canvas of the platform where the people waiting to meet him are. "Yes, you have an interesting story," said the man, grabbing the handle of his suitcase and rising from the bench. "Thank you for the conversation. I should go." No sooner had the man taken the step to the side than he heard loud shouts. Abruptly turning around and looking at the other end of platform, he realized that something terrible had happened. A young boy was lying on the pavement, and the crowd had gathered around him. People were actively waving their hands and shouting and interrupting each other. "I want an ambulance! An ambulance! The man is sick!" The young girl shouted louder than the others and leaned over the dead pale face of the boy. "Well, at last, my passenger who I've been waiting for has arrived," said the old man, and leaning on his cane began to rise heavily from the bench. "Who is that? Maybe we have to help the boy somehow," the man asked the old man anxiously. "You go ahead," the old man said, squinting his eyes slightly. "I can easily manage without your help. Otherwise, God forbid, you will be late for the departure of your train. You'll regret it later. Your ticket has been paid for." "Yes, but how can I go? There's—" "Go on," said the old man, and his voice became different, more firm and enlightening. To the excited man, it seemed that a moment the old man's pupils became reddish in color. But then they became normal again, and the glades looked tired and somehow faded again. "Good riddance. May your journey be easy and exciting. And don't forget to go out the platforms when the train will stop. After all, the stops are so few, and all of them short." The old man expressed his wishes to the man, turned around, and leaning on his cane, slowly walked in the direction of the crowd and the guy lying on the ground.